Welcome back. The aim of our next panel, New Responsibilities in a Changing Information Landscape, is to examine how the tools of misinformation exploit social tensions, knowledge uncertainties, and structural inequities to undermine evidence-based arguments for collective public action. How can science advice respond? Jurgis Vilcinskas, Deputy Head of Strategic Communications at the European External Action Service, will be moderating this session. The speakers are Dominique Brossard, Professor and Chair of the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Peter Halligan, Chief Scientific Advisor of Wales, Shirley S. Ho, Professor at the Wee School of Communication and Information at Nanyang Technological University, Kate Wilkinson, Deputy Chief Editor of Africa Check. Please take it away, Mr. Vilcinskas.
Thank you very much. And it's really a great pleasure to moderate a truly global panel. Representing panelists from 4 continents, 4 time zones, which are 12 hours apart, and most importantly, a very, very rich experience in research and fieldwork. In the next 40-45 minutes, our goal is to talk about science-related communication in a very, very fast-paced information environment. And in particular, look at the issues of trust in science, in scientists, and how these play out in the times of pandemic and in the times of high social tensions. We also plan to look at the impact of misinformation on science advice, and also into the response options that we have on tackling disinformation campaigns. When, especially in cases when false and misleading content is spread actually with intention to deceive the public or to secure economic or political gains. Our audience is very much welcome to pose questions in the chat, and as a moderator, I promise to put them on a virtual table as our discussion progresses. Let me kick off with a question on science and narratives. I mean, facts usually do not speak for themselves. Actually, most of us crave for the meaning and not so much for information. And in this light, framing the issues, using metaphors, coherent narratives, all of this kind of adds to make scientific advice, evidence heard and understood by the public. I want to turn to Dominique Brossard from University of Wisconsin-Madison, asking her the question, how could scientists, or maybe even beyond scientists, civil society, media, help design successful narratives to address misperceptions, misinformation, or even disinformation on the most topical scientific topics like pandemic, like climate change, and others? Dominique.
Thank you so much, Jurgis, and thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today and reconnect with all colleagues and friends and meeting new ones in this wonderful setting. So I'm so glad you asked this question, because as you mentioned, we are on this together. So it's not the scientists on the one hand, the journalists on the other hand, the academics on the other hand, by themselves that can help solve this issue, but really like a common effort to actually find those narratives that will resonate with those audiences. So instead of saying which narrative resonate, I would like to just pinpoint a few that would not resonate. Number one, I think we're all making the mistake to try to find easy answer to complicated question. And unfortunately in communication, like most problems that face society, there's no one easy fits all answer. And one of those that are not actually one that would fit is that trust fallacy narrative. We tend to have a hard time, choosing which information to trust, what scientists to trust, and so on. So the idea is, let's not just assume that the narrative saying the public is at fault because they don't know, they not trust, etc. That's not the way to go. Maybe like a more hopeful narrative would be to say, What do people think? What do people feel? Going back to actually the experience, the personal experience, the personal narrative to those that we're talking to. Number two, so like avoid the trust fallacy. Number two, a narrative that actually makes polarization and maybe even more political polarization to the narrative of science, I think is very dangerous. You received it in the United States from the starting point, climate change with Al Gore Inconvenient Truth, a documentary a while time back. For those of you who do not know, Al Gore was actually a candidate to one of the most contested elections after the one we had this year for presidential election in the United States as a Democratic candidate. So the United States, the Americans tend to think climate change is a Democrat issue. It's like, it's politically charged and it's always embedded in a political narrative. We've seen the same for the pandemic now, blaming Republicans not to be vaccinated. But this is not helpful. As I'm sure my colleagues are going to talk about as well, science may be political because we make decisions at funding, but science should not be partisan. Science should not be attached to a specific political party. So I think the media in their narrative, the journalists, the academics and so on, need to be very careful not to make science partisan. And the last thing I'm going to say to open the debate is, let's not forget to acknowledge uncertainties. Things that seem disinformation now, maybe because science was not settled when it was produced. And so it's easy later on to say, well, but that's misinformation. But you know what? When we talk about it as scientists, when journalists report on it, we need to say, well, right now we know this. In a week, it may be different. And I think we would go a long way if we were doing that. Just a few pointers here, and I hope I'm opening the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dominique. I think you have some couple of very thought-provoking questions. I'm sure we will come back to that in the discussion. But let me turn to Peter Halligan, Chief Scientific Advisor of Wales. And Peter, in your think piece that you submitted for the conference, you noticed that in times of emergencies, climate, pandemic, social inequality, scientists are kind of provided advice not only to the governments, but actually directly to much more skeptical public out there, And as Dominique mentioned, such communication very often involves a lot of uncertainties, a lot of moving targets. Talking to the audiences which are maybe not so privileged or so well educated, and often, sort of affected by different conspiracies. So here comes the question. I mean, how you, as a scientist, scientific advisor, how you adapt to the situations where evidence-based advice from scientific community is actually, not trusted and not at all prioritized.
Okay, thank you for the question. Thank you for inviting me to this panel today. I mean, as a scientist, I'm a psychologist by background. My approach to this is very much to actually look at, as Dominique has almost highlighted, the idea of asking the question of needing to better understand why people don't understand. Why don't they believe? Why don't they trust in authoritative elements of presentation? I'd also like to understand a bit more about their motivations, their intentions, and this distinction that you make between misinformation and disinformation. It's very clear that as a chief scientific advisor, for the most part, you're dealing with policy and ministerial colleagues, as it were. But actually, the extension of that into the general public, as I've indicated, means that you do have a much more skeptical audience, a much more challenging audience. And I think what we need to consider as scientists is not so much the supply side of the information, but the demand. The demand side is equally important, and we know that from in terms of policy officials and so forth, the work pressures, the understanding, the bases that they already have. Policymakers and the general public, we must recognize, have limited bandwidth. They will focus, like we all do, on our own beliefs and confirmation bias. Most relevant science, and particularly with regard to COVID, is incomplete, and much of it is ambiguous. It's a fertile ground with regard to people seeding their own explanations, and they will come up with their own explanations. And policymakers and the general public see scientific evidence as only one part, and I think that's something to recognize. So I think in terms of adapting, understanding and getting a better scientific basis, the way that people digest, understand authoritative sources of information, is probably the best way that we can go forward and work on this. From the point of view of operationally, what we do at the moment is we get scientists to present some of the evidence. And from that point of view, the credibility, and we know from the variety of veracity scales that are out there, scientists are actually trusted much higher than some politicians and so forth and the media. So from that point of view, one way of adapting is actually to ensure that credible, communicational friendly scientists can actually present that evidence in a digestible way.
To follow, if I may follow up with a question immediately here. I mean, you mentioned the demand side, right? What about, you know, this new digital information gatekeepers, you know, often the algorithms, you know, who rule, you know, which content becomes viral, you know, which content appears on your newsfeed, you know, how you deal with this issue when you want to reach actually these audiences with your authoritative message. And here I really invite also other participants to jump in.
Well, just responding directly back to you, I don't obviously control with regard to the media gatekeepers. We can control the presentation with regard to how we speak to the public as the media record that. But after that, you're absolutely right. The decision makers within, that's a second order sort of decision making as to how and what the interpretation. So in other words, the first order group that you're speaking to and trying to convince are actually those media gatekeepers. And then after that, they will take it upon themselves to reinterpret and describe what they consider to be. So from that point of view, in terms of working in government, our first priority is to some extent to get the messaging out there from the government sources authoritative. After that, we don't have the same degree of control in terms of the freedom of the press to actually interpret their way of the information flow.
Yeah, so if I may interject, also that we tend to forget is that, you know, we tend to talk about our system as monolithic and disconnect from one another. And when we say the public, the scientists, the media, when at the end of the day, we are all interlinked, and particularly when we talk about the social media platform. You know, recent data at the international level shows that audiences want to have good information. They don't want to be misled. They want to actually get pointers, right? As far as like what is that information out there. And so that leads to that notion of digital science literacy, what we haven't talked about, that idea that right now, most of us adults, we didn't grow up in an era when there was an internet, but the next generation is very different. And I think one you know, system that we haven't talked about is the educational system. I give a lot of talks to 12, 13 years old, you know, teaching them how to search online, how do you, well, the information you find, can you trust it, and so on. So we need to think about also giving the tools to the young minds to actually, you know, be able to face that digital world. I think digital literacy is very important.
Thank you, Dominique, for that intervention. Let us move a little bit, you know, and focus on the issue of trust for the moment. And Kate Wilkinson is actually a deputy editor at a very well-known, established Africa Check organization, I think, whose daily bread is essentially to debunk lies, harmful claims, making sure, you know, that it is all about the message, not about the messenger. Kate, I'm sure you know that lies travel much faster than truth, especially, you know, on social media. And, you know, both the platforms and politicians, they favor, you know, emotional, scandalous, half-truth content. So, Kate, what would be your recipe? You know, how we could basically address the erosion of trust in experts in science in light, you know, of this fast-changing information landscape and in light of the news consumption?
Thank you so much, Jurgis, and it's a great honor to be with you all today and be discussing what is probably the most pressing issue that we're facing at the moment when it comes to not just the pandemic, but the greater media landscape. I think that our first two panelists, both Dominique and Peter, have really hit 2 points on the head that I wanted to raise. And the bigger point that I want to bring up is the question and the real challenge of how we communicate uncertainty during a time of high stress, pressure and crisis. because we know that the need to know and the need to have certainty is a prevalent feature of human psychology, and that we tend to be averse towards ambiguity. And if we look back to the early days of the pandemic, we can really see that there was a breakdown in the way that scientific discovery and understanding of COVID-19 was communicated. And I think the reason for this is really two parts. There were things that the scientific community and role players in different countries and regions around the world could have done much better to help the public who really are tuning in to their press briefings, are not just always reading the media, but are often listening to really high-level scientists communicating quite complicated ideas. There are many things that could have been done to help bring the public along on that process, because some of the steps that were taken did undermine some of the trust in those key and really important stakeholders. The first is that, if you look back to February 2020, Dr. Anthony Fauci is on record as saying that the risk of the coronavirus to the US was minuscule. And there may be many who would take the statement as evidence that the scientific community didn't know what it was talking about, and proof that they shouldn't be trusted on maybe this and future health issues. But what that statement really reflected was the understanding at the time. And there are many more examples of this on this topic. And one that comes to mind is the ongoing, and probably one we're going to be dealing with for a while, and that's the topic of masking. But what is often viewed by the public as flip-flopping or not understanding what is happening is really just the scientific process and method in action. It's a process of testing, learning, concluding, refining. And so I think the first point is that we need communicators to put more time and energy into thinking about how they communicate, especially when they know that a wide range of people are plugging into the presentations. So a few ideas from fact checkers who have seen often this disconnect is be transparent. Make the information that you're basing your positions on freely available and easy to understand in multiple local languages. Clearly state what we know and why, what we don't know and why, and how this could change in the future, and what the likelihood is of our scientific understanding of important topics changing. And then when or if the science does change, we need to dedicate time to publicly explaining why and how. And this need for certainty and to report in black and white is also an issue in the media. And the media needs to take a big responsibility in not grabbing very definitive headlines that cast science as in rock, when often things will change. And when they do, the effect of that is an erosion in trust, not just in the scientific community, but in the media, who's an important conduit to the public.
You mentioned media. I mean, the role of media, especially so important, in the times where we have different polarizing views, on such issues, like, again, climate change or pandemic. I mean, do you think there is a sort of, again, a proven way to try to combat such polarization, which maybe is already there, in the society, which is, difficult to, difficult to mitigate, since we are using so many sources at the same time. We are reading, let's take pandemic, about it from so many different sources, and many of us are being exposed daily, I think, to the myths and conspiracies related to that. So it's difficult, really. Many of us live in a couple of different information environments, if you like. So what would be your advice? I mean, is there a good way, really, to combat it real time, live?
Yeah, so I think, this is the question and the struggle that we really have to deal with when we think about media in the modern infoscape. Is there are so many different challenges and pressing issues that they're facing: 24-hour news cycles, restructured newsrooms, limited resources. And the ask for media can often be seen as sometimes unreasonable, because they're often doing what they think is as much as they can do with what they have. But I think that they have to do more. And often this needs to come in the form of media literacy through the media, trying to be less reactive, identifying topics which we know are going to continue to be topics of contentious public debate, and looking to insert accurate evidence-based information into the media space, not always in reaction to contentious issues, so that it can stand alone without the polarizing effect of it being attached to maybe a very heated debate with very public figures. So at Africa Check, we are a fact-checking organization, so we sort of straddle two roles. One is we play a role as the media, reporting. We're often published in newspapers, but we also play an advocacy role. And it's really important to be proactive, to get good, accurate information out there, and to tell people where they can find accurate information, so that when the proverbial disinformation shit hits the fan, people are equipped to hopefully deal with it better.
I wonder, in terms of, tackling this issue, whether we can also use specific networks which are kind of on the ground at the local level, more, than relying on, far away scientists delivering, scientific advice from mainstream media. Are there any thoughts on that? Whether we can really use the local authoritative voices for that? Dominique, over to you.
Yeah, so this is a great point, and I want to applaud Kate. I mean, she really brought excellent points here. Local expertise is always a must, and they not always be the one that we think. That means that it's not always, the specific scientists that should go in a local community, but building on existing network and use opinion leaders at the local level. They can be actually in churches, they can be in business leaders and so on, can be extremely powerful. And as a matter of fact, in the context of the pandemic, I work here at UW-Madison. We work with the local officials at different county level that were relay, and it worked extremely well. So we were not the directly in line with the communities, but we had, different opinion leaders that work for that. The second thing that I wanted to know, to say that raised to Kate, and we didn't talk about it, is when we talk about media, and certainly they should have, rely on the networks of experts, and there's a lot online. The IIAS at UW in the United States offer also a list of expertise, but also they could build narratives of hope. We tend to actually always talk about doom and bad news and so on. I'm saying that because we have worked in a project here that with the IIAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, on how communities have responded to climate change. And we say and what a story that's called how we respond. And those stories have been used by other communities to also tell their story about climate change and say, oh, people are doing something. We're not all doomed. At the local level, there's something happening. Look, we can do something, which in social science we call the build self-efficacy. So I think we should also think about the narrative of hope versus the narrative of dooms.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Let's try to move slowly into the issue of addressing misinformation, addressing disinformation. And in fact, most of the recent studies suggest that actually debunking disinformation actually works if it is done in a proper way. And there are plenty, of movies, books, released basically, about different techniques that could be applied. However, often, of course, these efforts are really a drop in the ocean. We see plenty of low-cost, high-impact disinformation campaigns out there, deliberately seeking to mislead audiences, to manipulate their worldviews, amplify different conspiracies out there. And very often, in this case, it's also the voices of scientists, are essentially, intimidated, suppressed. So I want to now turn to Shirley Ho, Professor and Chair, Department of Life Sciences at Kim Wee School of Communication and Information in Singapore, and ask her, what would be her sort of take on how could policymakers and scientists actually better equip themselves to prevent and mitigate such disinformation attacks?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think my background, because I'm based in Singapore, and I guess my contribution to this session is really, what policymakers and scientists in Asia, especially, have done to combat misinformation. And basically, I think when you talk about fact checks, it's been done throughout the world, and there are a lot of studies that have shown that sometimes fact checks can have a boomerang effect, meaning that it may not work as well as policymakers have hoped for. So I guess from various research have shown that actually for fact checking, it is probably different strokes for different folks, and also depending on the country as well, because some certain fact-checking platforms may be maybe perceived as more reliable by the public compared to some others. So I want to cite some studies that I've conducted in Singapore, where, for example, recent years I have done some studies to look at public perceptions towards risk perceptions towards nuclear energy in Singapore, where we ran experimental studies to find out if certain fact-checking sites, or venue might be more effective in reducing risk perception when a misinformation is put out there to the public. And we actually found out that, especially in particular in the Singapore context, where factually, .gov, which is a government-run kind of a fact-checking platform, it's much more effective than fact-checking platform on the Straits Times, which is our national newspaper. So a fact-checking information, a piece of fact-check information that is sent out by the government through factually.gov.sg, which is a recognized government website, it's much more effective in reducing the risk perception that was generated by a piece of misinformation on nuclear energy. So it's much more effective than a media outlet. So our study actually shows that in the context of Singapore, different platforms may pan out differently. So I guess in other countries, there could be a case where the public, it's they perceive higher credibility towards certain platforms than the others. So I guess policymakers need to take note of it. And I think Kate and Dominique brought out a very good point about media literacy earlier on. I guess it's digital media literacy. That's really, really important, because that's where you actually try to inoculate the audience to some extent, because you give them the tool to realize that oh, this might be a piece of misinformation, this might not be accurate, and therefore maybe I should not be forwarding this piece of information through social media to my social networks, because then I'm participating in what most people would call fake news. I'm one of the disseminator of fake news or misinformation or disinformation. So, audience awareness, verification, and how and whether or not they will prevent themselves from further dissemination of those information. I think that's really important, and I think that's in the long run will give us more mileage in terms of combating, dis and misinformation. And also, I guess, just to add a few more points over here, policymakers definitely need to take note of ways to curb the spread of misinformation upfront, because especially with social media companies, I think they should work closely with social media companies like Facebook, WhatsApp, to curb the spread of misinformation, because they actually could do something about it from the onset. And if once the algorithm, the technology could detect those kinds of misinformation that it's likely going to be fake, then they can actually stop or take down those information from their sites. So that's one way to do that, using AI technologies for early detection of misinformation. And also one last point over here that I think it's really important, it's building a network of scientists, because actually scientists, some scientists, you know, like to engage in public, with the public. They like to talk about their research, you know, especially when, you know, in my own research with Singapore-based scientists, for example, I've done some studies with them, you know, asking them if they're willing to come forward to talk to the public about their research. And some of them, they are actually very willing to do that, especially when it involves scientific uncertainty. So for example, you know, the vaccination, there's always concerns that vaccination will cause autism. And some scientists whom I interviewed said that, you know, they're willing to actually come out to talk to the public to dispel this myth, because they think that this will mislead the public. So likewise, you know, when it comes to COVID-19, you also see many scientists and healthcare professionals coming out to dispel certain myths about the vaccine. So I guess, you know, scientists are actually willing to come forward. It's just, you know, there are a lot of barriers that are stopping them from coming forward. So for example, they often cite the lack of time, lack of communication training, and lack of institutional support for these kinds of efforts. So, and also they are afraid of the media to some extent. Some of them are afraid that journalists may sensationalize what they actually say and put their quotes out of context. So in these kinds of situations, you know, this actually, this is a kind of a pushback from the scientists in the sense that they are not willing to come forward. So building a network of scientists, I think it's important that policymakers, you know, build a network of scientists both regionally and as well as across continents, so that they can draw on their expertise when there is a need to fight this and misinformation. So I guess these are the few points that I would like to share with regard to this question.
And Shirley, I think you raised such an important point here about the power of media literacy campaigns. And especially how they intersect with the different social media platforms, which are often the drivers of some of the disinformation campaigns that we're seeing. Many fact-checking organizations around the world, including Africa Check, are part of Facebook's third-party fact-checking program, where we help the platform to fact-check, review, and then rate posts, which, if they're found to be false, are then down-ranked in results and on the feed. But the whole dynamic changes when you're trying to combat false information on a platform like WhatsApp, which is encrypted, it's a black hole, and you have absolutely no idea what's happening in there. So what we have found to be incredibly effective is to actually enlist the public on the platform, to view them as our allies, not only as people who want accurate information because they're signing up for our WhatsApp services, but as people who are actually taking an active role to, when they receive false information, to forward it on to an organization like us at Africa Check. But again, you know, measuring our impact, the changes that we're bringing about on a platform like WhatsApp is so difficult because there's zero analytics. You don't know how many people are reading your fact checks. But we do have some light at the end of the tunnel. We have been partnering with a leading American university for the last almost 12 months. And we are conducting a randomized control trial in a media literacy and fact-checking distribution program on WhatsApp, where content is sent to nearly 10,000 participants now. And we hope that by early next year, we'll have some results which show us whether that form of intervention can actually lead not just to behavior change, but also to belief change on the platform. So if there are any participants or panelists who are interested in that, hopefully we'll be able to share those results reasonably soon.
Peter, would you like to come in? We heard here a little bit of a blame on some of the scientists, you know, who are afraid of media and come up and make their voice heard, you know, especially on the more contentious, you know, policy issues. Do you think this has changed actually in the last 12 months, and actually the advisors of the governments in Science Matters are actually more proactive, more willing to use available means to them, including social media platforms, to deliver their message to the audiences?
Good question. I think some scientists clearly are very competent and able to engage in the public and are willing to do that. An awful lot aren't. And in some respect, if you look at science and science careers, for the most part, you're publishing for your peer review, and you move through your career structure up to professorship by doing and communicating within a certain understandable grouping that actually appreciate what you're doing and the rigor which you do it. I think that one of the challenges for a lot of scientists is the situation that's occurred as a result of COVID, the distinction between science as evidence and science for policy. And this is where there has to be a translational aspect between the science for policymakers, and then the fact that the policymakers themselves will have to draw upon that evidence and quote it as science-based or science-informed, and so to make certain policy decisions which then have implications for the public. But never before has science professionals been more in the public eye. And in many countries, scientific experts have become national spokespersons, expected not only to provide scientific evidence, but also to justify the policy actions, which in many cases are not solely based on the evidence. The reality in many of these times of crisis, the distinction then between the advisor and the policymaker can get blurred. And there can be an intense public debate about the scientific data and the information that's accredited to a particular policy, which obviously from the point of view of the MPIs and the restrictions on the general public wasn't necessarily something that a lot of people would have wanted, and actually wanted to question the evidence-based and the difference between different countries. So the general public, I think, in any of these situations where you're translating between the science into the policy, need to understand that the science provides a certain degree of expertise and incidentally will never able to resolve value conflicts to appeal to facts. But it's the responsibility of politicians to actually weigh that evidence and then come up with decisions with regard to policy choices. So I would argue that no matter what the evidence base, the policies that need to be selected need to be understood and adopted by the general public. And that is particularly the onus on good scientists who are able to understand their subject area and also understand their audience.
Yeah, excellent remarks, Peter. I'd like to add also that I think sometimes science, with a big S, is used as a political tool in the public sphere, if you wish. When we say science-based policy, what does it even mean? Because any scientific fact have to be taken in context, depending on the policy decision we would want to make. And at the end of the day, I think it's also the role of the journalist to explain to different audiences how policy is made. Policies are political decisions that actually compromise between different type of evidence. So it can be scientific evidence, it can be also, the constraint of a specific society, a specific point in time. It can be political constraint, it can be. But science evidence is only one of the toolbox to make policy. And I think to some extent, when we say science-based evidence, we're misleading our audiences, like make it sound like the only way to decide policy is just on science. Obviously, we do want science evidence to be in the mix, but we also need other type of inputs that actually go beyond science.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, indeed, there's definitely choices to be made. And I think in this panel, I think we looked at different, let's say, elements, that are really, really important, and how we shape the narrative, how we shape the trust, around the science and politicians, media, all the civil initiatives, that, can be driven through either through education, from media literacy, digital literacy, fact-checking activities. I mean, these are all really kind of important, makes this combination, of assets that we have here to enable evidence-informed policymaking in our democracies. But before we round up this panel, I would like a little bit to come up with a sort of 1-2 minute blitz question to every panelist and ask you, what causes you sleepless nights, when you think about mistrust, about misinformation, about science and scientific method. What really bothers you? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to kick us off. I think what causes me sleepless nights, maybe because I'm a bit of a policy nerd, is that every country has its own set of pressing problems, but you'd probably be hard pressed to find a country that beats South Africa when it comes to the scale and the depth of the problems that it faces. And we often see just a complete misunderstanding or complete misinformation embedded in government decision makers who are either misinformed or know that they're not basing their decisions on the right information and move forward anyway. And when we have such pressing problems and such limited resources, that misinformation doesn't just mislead people, but it can ultimately lead to the reallocation of resources away from equally important issues because of false information, because a stat has been misrepresented or misunderstood. And I think that really the impetus for a lot of the work that our organization does and what keeps me going is that I want to make sure that our government can make the best decisions based on the best data to really try and tackle our big and pressing problems.
What would be your take on this?
I can follow up. I mean, building on what Kate is saying, what really irritates me to no end is when we think about science communication, let's not forget social science communication. And there's a lot that we know about human psychology, human behavior, and so on, as Shirley was pointing out. And maybe as social scientists, we're not doing really well at communicating all this, but I feel like we're always reinventing the wheel. In new pandemic, we know risk communication, we know persuasion, we know a lot of things, and again the same mistakes and the same misinformation and so on is done, by the way, by all the actors. And so it's just that sometimes you feel that all of us should be better at communicating in that infodemic, if you wish, but also, making sure that we build bridges between disciplines to make sure that, there is, we build on each other's strength more than, doing our little thing and communicating in our own little world.
Peter, can we go over to you?
Was that for me?
Yeah. What makes you worry? Around the issues of mistrust and misinformation around the science and scientific method.
Well, many of the things that Dominique and Kate has talked about. I mean, I think the real sleepless night situation is where you have the science and you have the capacity to contribute to resolve something that saves people's lives or the quality of their lives, and it's misconstrued in a way that either through ignorance or through lack of knowledge, or worse still, by people who have a political or economical or whatever agenda to misrepresent that information so that actually people don't necessarily take up on the information. An awful lot of the information in terms of COVID was the idea of voluntary compliance. It was very difficult to ensure that in a perfect way. And therefore, the information that was communicated through the media sources in particular, the responsible media sources, were hugely important with regard to getting the virus and the reaction to the virus under control. So I think the sleepless night sort of scenario is the idea that opportunities are taken by individuals who don't necessarily have the full interests of the public at heart to disseminate disinformation, which would actually cause loss of life and loss of health.
Let us move now to Singapore, to Shirley, which is really having a sleepless night because it's past the midnight over there.
Yeah. So my clock is ticking as well, but actually, I agree with what Peter has said. You know, it actually can cause sleepless nights if policymakers say different things. You know, there are conflicting voices in the media, and that policymakers are saying different things, especially, you know, across different ministries. If they're saying conflicting information about, for example, the pandemic right now, this can cause big chaos among the public. But thankfully, in Singapore, the situation is that the government actually, and across different ministries, they say the same thing. And the message to the public is it's quite uniform. So, for example, we have to wear a mask. So, you know, that's evidence-based, but, you know, at the same time, it's not just scientific evidence. There are also other policy considerations as well. So contrary to other parts of the world, I actually have, I can sleep quite well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I think our time is running out. I mean, it was a very exciting discussion, fantastic panel. I would like to thank everybody who joined, who contributed, who also put questions in the chat, and over to the organizers for the next session.
Thanks to all of the panelists for sharing their compelling insights, and also to Jurgis Vilcinskas for moderating.